Okay, let me turn to the other talk, and I apologize, but we are pressed a little bit for time. So, okay. So let me turn to the second talk, which is what I'm calling thinking about thinking. And again, you guys do a lot of thinking, and a lot of really high-end, great thinking, or you wouldn't be here. So I feel a little awkward about doing this, except that, again, I feel like for people that are setting out on a career that ultimately involves, alongside lots of other activities, a lot of thinking, we don't do a lot of reflection about the things that cultivate sharper, better, more effective thinking. And this is something that, again, I think our program does well. And so, I just want to kind of give you a sense of some of the things that I've encountered over the course of my time on Earth and in this profession, which I think help. And these are not, again, things that I exemplify. These are things that I kind of aspire to. They're things that I've kind of cobbled together collectively from all the people who I think really, really well. And it's kind of a hybrid of some of the things that I abstract from what I think they're doing to make that possible. So I pass some of these along. I'm going to do them, there are a bunch of them, I'm going to do them really, really quickly. So to the extent that this is kind of like a low-rent TED Talk, it's going to be really fast. So hopefully, to the extent there's some pontification and pomposity, my hope is that we'll at least you won't suffer for very long. So, okay. All right, so I gotta go back. I missed that. Okay. Intelligence is mostly grit. All right, and what do I mean by this? This is, I guess, my first two slides that I call my imposter syndrome slides. One of the kind of clear symptomologies of grad school, at least as I experienced it, is this kind of recurring sense that you don't belong, that there's some evidence that is surfacing that this is the wrong place, that some huge cosmic error has occurred that you and your colleagues are suffering from. And the symptom of this is that you are having difficulty, usually in the classroom, apprehending something where you're just having difficulty, and this becomes this existential crisis. And it's a sign that maybe inherently your own intelligence just doesn't live up to the task that is being demanded of you. And what we're falling back on when we do that is weird, very powerful and resilient notions of intelligence as a bounded fixed quantity, which have been mostly disproven by cognitive psychology, but which are very powerfully reinforced in popular culture. And when we're feeling anxious, as grad school encourages us to do, we're going to fall back on them. We can be reassured, though, in the sense that I think the recent studies suggest that, in fact, intelligence is flexible. It's expansive. It's the kind of thing that it changes depending on what you get behind it and push it to do. And so I think in terms of these thinking about thinking, I think understanding that grit, that is to say, the willingness that you have to try to take on weight that you know at this particular moment you can't take on, is actually, that is intelligence. That is what's going to move your own intellectual capacities along. And that's very different from a lot of the conventions that we fall back on, particularly in moments of imposter syndrome. That's my first. Okay. Again, part two of imposter syndrome. The solution, know what you know and know what you don't know. And again, this can seem obvious. But if you're feeling, in the context of grad school, that, again, you're an imposter, you're going to be called out at any moment about some crucial interpretation or fact or text. One solution to that is to just be confident and realistic about what you do know, what you don't know. You don't try to defend beyond the zone of what you know. But when people are on that terrain conversationally or in class, you can be confident that you do know. And I think actually just monitoring where that line is, hopefully it moves outward rather than inward over time, can be one very compelling answer to imposter anxiety. You just pull back from the sense that you're responsible for things that you don't know. Doesn't mean you can't know them, doesn't mean you won't know them, it just means you don't know them yet, right? If you venture beyond that line, okay, maybe you are an imposter, right? Maybe you should pull back. But as long as you pull back to that line and assess where it is, you would have less reason to wear the grouch is. Okay. Own your superpower. Okay, what I mean by superpower is that I really feel like everyone, but I think particularly for people that end up in grad school, there's going to be some particular capacity that you have which is outsized, which is exaggerated vis-a-vis your colleagues, and maybe the profession, maybe humanity at large, right? And often these can be incredibly quirky. It's going to be your ability to read texts, like primary documents. It may be a facility with acquiring languages. It may be your ability to understand the architecture of a whole historiography. right? It might be that you're a very keen viewer of visual images. There's going to be some bizarrely acute part of your intelligence. And likely you already know what it is, or you're already inhabiting it, whether you're fully aware of what it is. What I'm suggesting here is that you get to know it and think about it self-consciously as a kind of superpower. Because I think that can really help. I think, in part, as you deal with the kind of tensions and stresses of grad school, to kind of know there is this thing that makes you truly exceptional. I think it's also good to think about that as the basis for your research agenda. You want to build your research agenda to some extent centered in and around, somewhere around your superpower. It should be in the mix. If you deliberately build it outside, you're not doing yourself a service. Now, if you build it entirely on the ground of your superpower, you're not doing yourself a service either, as we'll talk about in a second. But I do think it's important to kind of know it, cultivate it, try to work with it, and to try to harness it, because that's something that you need that vitality, you need that intensity to succeed as a thinker and as a professional academic. Okay, now, having owning your superpower, I want you to head for your weakness, right? Now why? Why, if you have the superpower, should you venture out from it? Well, because I think knowing that we all have this particularly well-developed source of power can also be a real risk. And I actually feel like for most academics, they stick very safely in and around the things that their mind already does well. The places that their mind goes natively when it just goes into a resting phase. And in fact, depending on where that superpower is situated to the trends and fashions of the time, you can make a whole career out of that. It doesn't make you a very interesting thinker, necessarily, but you can make an intellectual career work. Now, I'm not talking about in this talk how to be a successful academic. I'm trying to talk about how to be a successful thinker, right? And the Venn diagram between those two can actually not overlap as much as we think. And I think in order to cultivate the part of this that's about thinking, we actually need to be aware as much of the things we do really well as the things that we don't. And we actually need to use the confidence and command that comes from that really great capacity and to stretch it into those areas where we know we're going to be vulnerable. So if you're a great natural cultural historian taking a course or reading an economic history, right? If you're doing high political history, reading cultural theory, critical theory, it's precisely, to me, ultimately the measure of a really successful academic thinker is the range and the spectrum of their thinking vis-a-vis all of these other fields. And the only way that you do that is if you actually venture into danger areas, into areas where you're going to be less safe, where you know you're going to have to stretch. And ultimately the goal, I think, is to stretch and to then reincorporate these areas into your area of strength, so that broadens and gets kind of cross-pollinated and enriched as it moves outward from the area that you're really confident about. Okay, along these lines, I suggest that you fail well and fail often. This, again, is counterintuitive vis-a-vis grad school, right? What do I mean by failure? I mean, what I mean is that when you stretch out beyond your areas of competence and command, you're going to screw up, right? When you venture beyond these disciplinary divides, there are going to be mistakes. And here I think it's important to realize there's a real paradox in grad school, which is that what I think we ought to be doing, and our fundamental task, is experimentation, right? And this kind of stretching, and yet in very practical day-to-day terms, a lot of what we feel responsible for is performance, right? And the sense is that in these seminars, your job is to show me and my colleagues that you're always in your zone of command, right? And that if you fail, it's going to be a disaster for your reputation. And I think that's a problem with graduate education more generally. That we need to work harder to make this a place where people can experiment and where they can fail productively. Now, what's the difference between failing productively and unproductively? And there isn't some important differences. I mean, one is that you fail in the effort to move in a direction that ultimately your mind and your projects want to go. That's an important. But the other is that you then think hard about why it failed, you go back, you revisit, you try again, right? So it's something about the lessons that you take away from the failure. But I think trying to kind of overcome what I think of as the sociological pressure to always perform, which for me has a deeply anti-intellectual and anti-thought kind of impulse, even though it's a natural and understandable part of the way any community sets itself up. And I think it's something that as a community we should try to work harder to counter, because I think it actually goes directly against our core mission. We should allow each other to fail, right? Precisely so that our work can improve. Okay. Ask reasonably dumb questions, all right? What do I mean by this? Part of the reason, part of the way that you expand the horizon of your knowledge and your thinking into these new areas is you have to build new foundations, right? And to do that, you have to ask what I'm calling reasonably dumb questions. Now, I put in reasonably because I do think there are such things as dumb questions. But I think one way to think about a dumb question is a foundational question, right? And one of the things, again, because of this performance anxiety that we bring into graduate education, is we feel uncomfortable asking the foundational questions. And for me, particularly when you're at the beginning of something, which you should be as you venture out into these new areas, you need to build those foundations. If there's something that's happening inside this field that you just don't understand, what is everybody so bugged about? Why is this keyword such a problem? What is this debate about? The tendency, and I think it's a tendency that actually most academics embody, is because you're afraid of looking dumb, you don't ask those questions. And then what you're building on is essentially an incredibly weak foundation. There's nothing down there, right? You can build what looks like a lot of very sophisticated apparatus, but you're not able to fully make it your own because you don't ask the basic questions that get down into the base of how this new area is constructed, what its preoccupations are, what its concepts are. So for me, the only way to do that is to actually give yourself the permission and to be courageous enough to ask reasonably dumb questions, right? Dumb questions, foundational questions that are going to help you build up the basics and the foundations that you need. Okay, discovery hurts. I think we don't talk a lot about the emotional dimensions of thinking, right? But I think we should. And very briefly to touch on that, we expect that discovery is going to look like a eureka moment, right? It's going to be this fantastic moment when like the clouds part, right? And that's not actually the way it often feels. And I think actually being attuned to the kind of discrepancy between the way that what we are doing, or I think what our goal is, which should be some form of discovery, feels, I think can actually help us get there more. Because we can also experience emotions that we are not accustomed to feeling or don't think we should be feeling. In my own experience, and the experience of a lot of friends and colleagues of mine in a variety of fields, in the humanities, in the social sciences, in the STEM fields, is that actually discovery hurts. Right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, right? But it's not eureka moment. It's not like, a terrific feeling off. Why does it hurt? Right? First, because it involves you throwing off the shackles of some previous way of seeing the world and interpreting your evidence. And that can be painful, right? You've got commitments to that interpretation, right? There are scholars that you really respect that are indebted to that other way, and you found some other way, and it can be very bewildering. Right? It can hurt because you then got to persuade a lot of these people, including people that you respect, that actually they were a little off, right? And that you've got an interpretation that works a little better. And that can be difficult in, again, sociological terms. Just like we want to get along, we want to have friends. We don't want to tell them that they should rethink. Right? Rethinking for most people is a painful process, right? And that's something that is worth acknowledging from the very beginning. And it means that we've got to be prepared to grapple with the fact that what we are setting out to do with this some form of discovery is not always going to bring us happiness, right? Okay, don't overdo it on either judgment or perception. Okay, if any of you have taken like Myers-Briggs or any of these kind of personality tests, right? There's this one axis that every person has where you're on some kind of spectrum between being intensely judgmental, which means you kind of come into any situation, you know what you think about it, right? You've already kind of worked it out in terms of your categorical scheme. There's another axis that heads off towards perception, right? You're going to be very attuned, your antennae are out to kind of registering phenomena, trying to describe them, not trying to apprehend them in strong judgmental ways or interpretations. This is maybe a banal point, but I think it's worth reflecting on just because each of us is somewhere on that spectrum, and we may not know where we are, and we want to be, for purposes of academic history, somewhere in the middle. And so knowing where you are natively on that spectrum can help you counterbalance some of your own tendencies in ways that I think is actually really worth knowing. There are scholars I know who are like really on the judgment side, and you can tell it when you read their stuff. They've got it all figured out, right? They're often very heavily analytically framed, theoretically framed. You get the sense that the kind of evidence is the icing on the cake, right? That's kind of pushing really hard on the judgment side. On the perception side, sometimes you get really descriptive works, where you get long, spooling out narratives, lots of characters, lots of things happening. But at the end of the day, you have no framework for understanding what this buzzing, blooming confusion was about, right? Keeping those in play, I think, is really important, just as a general. So knowing where you are on that spectrum, owning it, trying to counterbalance some of your own tendencies, I think is a good thing to try to cultivate. Okay, gather curiosities. This is something that I advise students that I advise. Very quickly, from the first week of grad school, something that I recommend, and maybe something that a lot of you do already, is to keep a separate notebook where the things that you're encountering that really excite you, that really frustrate you, quibbles or quarrels that you're having with texts, primary documents that really get your juices flowing, you put them down. You don't have to ask why they're there. It's better not to ask why they're there, right? But you keep it there. It can be a source of inspiration. It can be a source of excitement. It can be a source of potential research topics. And importantly, I think it's a way later to do some mapping about what your problem is. What is the problem that you want to try to solve? What are the themes that your mind keeps coming back to again and again as you're doing this reading? And the reason I think it's important to keep it in a separate notebook is that obviously you're going to be inundated with this huge torrent of texts, right? And if you don't put it down somewhere, this stuff's just going to get lost. So kind of one way to think about, the metaphor that I think is just like if you think about like a grizzly bear like in a salmon stream where they're trying to, and there's this enormous amount of water rushing by, and they're trying to bat the salmon out, right? That's what you're trying to do with this, right? You're trying to get nutritious, enriching, yummy stuff out of the enormous amount of water that's going to flood over you in graduate school. And it's stuff that's going to keep you afloat creatively in terms of inspiration and in terms of research. Okay, reality is interdisciplinary. Okay, this is getting a little abstract. But one of the things that occurs to me, it's important to realize that, again, each of us is going to be comfortable with a certain set of methodological commitments too, right? It's going to be the stuff we're comfortable with. When we say, I'm an ex-historian with the adjective, cultural, political, whatever, we're declaring, in a sense, this is the way my mind ticks, right? There's a name out in the profession for the way that I like to think my mind works. The problem is that reality doesn't necessarily work that way, right? Again, speaking in very broad terms about reality. So the reason that we have to stretch methodologically is that the way most academics proceed is they take the very narrow band of things that they're good at, they find a disciplinary name for it, and then they try to persuade the world that history turns on that particular social and causal axis, right? I happen to think otherwise, right? And so part of the reason why I think we have to build a commitment to interdisciplinary into what we do is because reality doesn't really care what it is that our minds are best at doing and what the profession decides to call these categories of political, social, right? History, etc. Okay, so just realizing that our work is going to be impoverished by definition vis-a-vis our account of some kind of historical reality if we are not keeping the spectrum of methodologies and approaches as broad as possible. Okay, voice selects audience. What do I mean by this? Why do I have a picture of Chewbacca here? What I mean is that when you sit down to actually write a piece of text, it's important to kind of have a sense of your audience and to calibrate the voice that you're using, the kind of performance of who you are in that text to a prospective reader, to the audience you're trying to reach. When you make that determination, it's happening on lots of different axes, right? There's an axis from the popular audience to the professional audience. There's an axis of the specialist to the non-specialist within the profession. There's an axis from the more overtly political, right, to the more, I should say, the less obviously political. I don't think anything we write is not political. I think we often have a set of voices that we're comfortable with, that we fall into naturally. I think we're not always as self-conscious as we ought to be about what decisions we're making in the register that we choose in terms of reaching the kind of audience that we want to reach. That's not to say, this is not to say that we should reach any particular kind of audience. That's up to you in terms of your writing and the kind of intellectual you want to be. But just being aware always that there is another person out there that you're trying to communicate with. And this is an act of communication. And this is, again, something that may seem obvious, but so many academics think about their writing not in terms of communicating to actual people, right? Let alone a specific subset of people. It's about getting their brilliant ideas on the page, moving through the bureaucracy, getting the check boxes, putting this on your CV. It's actually not about thinking about how are the words that I put on the page going to communicate with a specific set of people I'm trying to reach. Okay. Ask and don't answer with concepts. What do I mean by this? One of the risks, I think, in academic life is that there are these concepts that we develop that become the coin of our thinking. And debates and interpretations hinge on these kinds of concepts. I think these are great if we ask questions with these concepts. They're exactly the kinds of things that we need in order to make the complexities of our situations legible to ourselves and to our audiences. But one risk of them is that we can begin to substitute them in for the phenomenon itself. And this is something that I see a lot of scholarship on reading these days, where you get a whole set of empirical and descriptive details, but at the end of the day, it comes down to a preformed concept that happens to usually be a really sexy or trendy concept, not surprisingly. And all of this accumulated data funnels down to this thing that we really already knew. And that, to me, is a case of where you're answering with a concept rather than asking with a concept. And so that's something that may not be an occupational hazard that any of you run into, but it's something that I'm seeing more and more, and it's just something that I'm cautious of in my own thinking as well. That if you can enlist concepts, and ask questions, and reframe questions, but to pull back from funneling the realities you're describing into those concepts, that strikes me as a good use of those. Okay, take on problems, not topics. This is something that I discussed a little bit in the talk I gave at my dissertation topics, but basically, one of the myths of what we do in history is that we study topics. This is what we talk about. What are you working on? What's your topic? And that makes sense for all kinds of reasons, but I think it's more productive to think about our topics in terms of the problems that they help us solve and that they organize our imaginations towards. And I think the sooner in a research investigation you can move from the topic to the problem, the better. And how does that happen? Well, I think you kind of think about, okay, why am I interested in this topic, right? And often the problem is that we're attracted to a topic, and there's an underlying problem, but the problem isn't what appears to us as exciting. What appears exciting to us is the topic. It's what's happening at the surface. And so I think it's important to take our thinking down another level, to think about what's the problematic, right? What is the puzzle or the conundrum that I'm really interested in that is expressed through this particular topic? And I think ultimately building our research projects and our dissertation ultimately around that problematic is likely to make it much richer, much more powerful. In part because it allows us to think about what we're doing not just as kind of filling a hole in the wall, right? No one has worked on my topic before, so I'm going to do this topic, right? That's not an argument for doing scholarship, right? Ultimately, I think, because we're not filling a kind of brick of knowledge. So thinking about what we're doing in terms of problems and problematics. Find your wall, break it, and find your next wall. What I mean here is that, and this again ventures into the personal and psychological more than we're often comfortable in the profession. In my experience working with scholars, colleagues, students, and myself, is that one of the major limits in all of our lives is going to be there's something extra intellectual, extra academic, some limit that we have. It's going to be something you probably bump into again and again and again in the profession. You may not be able to take criticism. You may be overconfident in your ideas. You may be underconfident in your ideas, right? Not willing to stand up for yourself. You may have difficulty going back and revising something you've written. There are these things that are irrational, ultimately. There are things that may come from some other completely different zone of your life, right? But they're going to have profound implications for your life as a thinker and your life as an academic. Trying to figure out, as soon as you can, when these patterns start to emerge, what your wall is. Trying, over time, being gracious and patient with yourself to get through it, on to the other side so you can find the next wall, is going to pay endless dividends. You'll know one of these walls when you see it and experience it, and they're in endless variety, so I'm not going to go into them. But just to know that these kinds of things can appear, and because academic life and the life of thinking requires so many different skills of us, none of us are going to have all of them personally. Right? So it's about taking what you have with all of its limits and all of its strengths and trying to fill out those capacities. And the way you do that is when you hit one of these walls, you don't shame it, you don't deny it, you acknowledge it, you try to figure out how to get through it. Okay, much more direct and practical. Collect unlikely words. What I mean here is that each of us comes into the life of thinking, an academic life, with what linguists call an idiolect, right? It's this fingerprint of words. There are going to be some words that any of us use all the time, and some of us will use none of the time, right? That if you were to do a kind of word map of each of us, it would be this crazy fingerprint of words, right? So why do I say gather unlikely words? Because one way to think about thinking is that the smallest unit of thought is actually not the idea, but the word. This is a concept that I came upon recently in a quote by Susan Sontag, which I like a lot. That each word comes with it a series of connotations, of histories, of meanings, of potentialities, which is distinct. And if that word is not in your idiolect, in your existing fingerprint of words, that is not available to you, right? And so something that I do, actually, as a matter of habit, is when I come upon a word that I don't use, that can do some of this work for me that I would like done, but this is not a word I come by naturally, I put it down somewhere. Just to make sure that it increasingly is a part of the mix. And again, this is a very small gauge kind of intervention, but I think it's one that over time can have a lot of benefits in terms of widening your conceptual palette. Because again, there are going to be certain concepts that because of your background, the particular cultural milieu in which you were raised, words that just come naturally to you, that you use and employ, and you can use those to do all kinds of work, but there are also going to be limits. And the only way to kind of stretch those or move beyond is actually to collect unlikely words, words that are not a part of the ones you encounter regularly. Okay, respect your opponents. How are we doing on time? Oh, I should be winding down. All right, I've only got a couple more. I'll speed up. Respect your opponents. In academic life, we're arguing with each other all the time. We should be arguing with each other all the time. When I say respect your opponents, I mean that, number one, that you should have opponents. I mean, not in the sense of life and death, right, or like putting on crazy masks, but like we want there to be some conflict in this, right? There should be stakes. But when I say respect your opponents, I mean that you should treat them fairly when you critique them, because you would want that in turn. But also because it's going to make your own work stronger. If you're actually thinking of your opponents as people you don't respect, you need other opponents, right? Because you want to be quarreling with people that you think are worth quarreling with. And the only way to do that is to really think hard about the people that you're arguing with and are they worth the time and energy and effort. So again, thinking about that kind of antagonism is not a problem in academia, but one you want to think about both in terms of maintaining stability, but also in terms of making sure that the challenges that you're taking up are also ones that are going to move your own work forward, right? The people worth arguing with are going to do that for you. Okay, don't fall in love with your ideas. Sometimes we think we're getting very clever, right? We come up with something in a piece of work we do. We want it to do everything, right? We take it on the road. We apply it in lots of different situations. This again becomes part of the political economy of the profession. You can make a career out of taking these things around, branding them, right? Making sure that everyone knows that you've come along with these concepts. That can be great for building a professional career. It's not necessarily good for the life of thought, right? In part because those ideas you can want them to do much more than they should do. Over time, you may not allow your own thinking to evolve beyond those ideas because they're your ideas. They are these clusters of things that you have put together that you attach to and associate with. So being provisional, even about the ideas you're excited about, I think can prevent that as a problem over the long term. Okay, similarly, don't brand yourself. Right? Again, this goes against some of the conventional wisdom in the political economy of the profession, which is, I'm going to do this thing and I'm going to just go around and make sure everybody knows that I'm the guy or gal who does this over time. Right? That can be something you can build a career on. I don't necessarily think it's good over the long term for creative thinking, in part because you may begin to self-censor. To decide, I'm not the kind of person who studies that. I'm really interested in that. That would really be great. I'm just not that kind of person, right? That's a case where you branded yourself and you start to believe in your own brand, right? And at that point, you're inhibiting your own creativity and your own intellectual vitality in the name of what your imagination and market forces are telling you. Okay. Criticism is usually better than neglect. Again, it doesn't always feel that way in grad school. Right? We want accolades, we want to be patted on the back for the work we're doing. That makes perfect sense. But understanding that, arguably, until something is published, and maybe even afterwards, anyone who gives you a critical take is giving you something you can use to improve the work to strengthen it and to move your own thinking ahead. And that can happen at lots of different levels, rhetorically, conceptually, other sources, right? And something to realize is that grad school is a time when you all can and should make demands on us to be critical of your work. Once you're out in the broader profession, it's very hard to get people to sit down with your stuff. Everybody's busy, everybody's overcommitted, right? But the only way that that can work is if you look forward to the criticism in a sense, right? And demand it of us, and if we then follow through on that. But it's much better to be criticized than to have your work in a vacuum. So, okay, fight cognitive bias. This again is very basic, but also not so basic. Right? As a function of the way we all work, there are going to be certain kinds of things that we do that make our thinking more cloudy. Right? And there are a whole series of these that cognitive psychologists have explored. For example, if you have read a book recently about something, you're more likely to apply that technique or that approach to something else just by virtue of its temporal proximity. Right? Learning all about cognitive bias and trying to then look for the symptoms of it in your own thinking, I think, can make your thinking more sharper and more effective. Okay, the prime directive. Okay, this is the last, all right, and then I'll finish up. Do not identify. What I mean by this is, historians especially fall prey to identifying with some of their subjects or another. I run into almost everyone that I encounter, students, colleagues, etc., in the profession. It's very hard to not be seduced by the people we study. Why? Because we're attracted to them for one reason or another. We spend an awful lot of time in their heads and in their texts, right? And it's very hard for their words not to slip into our own language. It's also very hard for us not to pick sides in the struggles that they're involved in and to feel like we have to take sides in ways that polarize the ethics and the politics of our own perspective along the same axes that our historical actors did. To me, this is fatal to historical work. That's why I call it the prime directive. To me, it's so important that you have a critical angle of vision, even about the people you like, maybe even especially about the people you like. The reason for doing this, I think, is to be respectful of them, on the one hand, because if you identify them, ultimately you're not going to pay attention to them, you are making them ventriloquize yourself, right? Without their permission, right? And without your own self-awareness. And so, really being quite careful about you can treat your actors sympathetically,